the award-winning film director, Oliver Stone. He's a socially minded master whose films deal with American politics and history head-on. In 2012, Stone released The Untold History of the United States. The 10-part documentary series challenges conventional beliefs held by many Americans. One is that dropping atomic bombs on Japan helped end World War II.
And I saw immediately another side of history that I had not been aware of, because like many people of my generation, I accepted the official story about the atomic bomb, that we had to drop it, that it ended World War II and the Japanese would have fought on. But this looks at the whole thing in a different way.
I was surprised to learn that we didn't need to.
Quite interesting, and told me things about certainly American history that I was not aware of.
Stone traveled to Hiroshima and Nagasaki for the first time to understand what really happened there.
It was a very interesting morning. I feel the moment very strongly, as did many people in the park.
Stone met with Hibakusha and listened to their stories.
Why did the U.S. use two different kinds of atomic bombs? People here in Nagasaki were nothing but guinea pigs.
Many Hibakusha question the true motives for bombing Japan. Stone responds by stressing the importance of facing up to history.
This history makes people uncomfortable, like Japanese history. True Japanese history makes Japanese uncomfortable. And after 70 years, you have a time zone, a time span. People grow comfortable with lies.
Oliver Stone has explored the scars of war in Japan. On this program, he joins us to discuss Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and the United States.
Today we'll talk with director Oliver Stone and Professor Peter Kuznick, who co-authored the script for The Untold History of the United States. We also have two other guests here in the studio. Welcome.
Thank you.
What did you think of the documentary?
It was fascinating. It breaks down everything people take for granted about U.S. history. The lies of common sense, if you will. It's academically well-grounded, too. And all the movie clips were an added bonus I really enjoyed.
Mr. Besho?
Mr. Stone is a director I greatly respect and admire. As an actor and fellow human being, I'm interested in learning where his passion for making the documentary came from.
Now let's welcome film director Oliver Stone and historian Peter Kuznick of American University. We'd like to speak with you both about the atomic bombs, war, and the United States. Mr. Stone, please tell us what you're feeling right now.
My current emotional state is exhaustion. I've been in Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and Tokyo for about 10 days. Interviews, talking about history. I'm tired, but I'm going on to Okinawa tomorrow with Peter, and we're going to be looking at all the Okinawa story.
Mr. Kuznick, is your understanding of history in line with Mr. Stone's? Is that why you took part in creating this documentary?
Well, actually, the interesting thing is that we come from different perspectives. Oliver started off as a conservative. Oliver comes from a family, a conservative family. His father was on Eisenhower's staff in Paris in World War II. And Oliver was a supporter of Republican Barry Goldwater in 1964 at college. He's in the same class as George W. Bush at Yale. My family was very, very liberal. And so I was a civil rights activist in high school, junior high school. By the time I was in college, I was an anti-war activist. And the interesting thing about this collaboration, it brings together a historian and a dramatist. So I know a lot of the history, and I can write some of the scripts, and Oliver can make this a story that's so exciting, vivid, compelling, that people want to watch it, even people who aren't that interested in history.
Mr. Kuznick, you've come to Japan with Mr. Stone. Is there any special reason?
I've been wanting to bring him to Hiroshima and Nagasaki for a long time. And I knew that if Oliver came, he would get a sense of the reality of this part of history, because it's the starting of the post-war empire for the United States, really. The atomic bombing, the American hegemony, the start of American militarism.
The initial inspiration for Stone's documentary was the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He visited the cities in August 2013 for the first time.
Can you imagine that moment? Yeah. How far above the dome did it drop? Did it explode?
Yeah. Well, some people actually watching it.
They watched it.
They watched the bomb was coming down.
Yeah. Yeah. They were sitting there watching. They were blinded, most of them.
Yeah.
Their eyes melted.
Yeah.
Stone arrived in Hiroshima and headed straight for the Peace Memorial Museum. He was curious to know how exhibits there explain the U.S. rationale for dropping the bomb.
So in other words, you feel that Hiroshima was a satisfactory target, given the nature of...
Oh, yes, because it was a military base, of course. There's no doubt about it.
Stone stopped in front of a display about the reasons for the attack. It says the U.S. wanted to limit the post-war influence of the Soviet Union and justify the huge cost of developing the atomic bomb to American citizens. Stone attended numerous events featuring hibakusha. He listened intently as they spoke. Sumiteru Taniguchi was 16 and delivering mail in Nagasaki when the bomb exploded. He hovered between life and death after being exposed to the bomb's intense heat rays.
This photo was taken about a month later. I spent a year and 9 months lying on my stomach. Some people say dropping the bombs was the right thing to do, to end the war more quickly. But why did the U.S. use a different type of atomic bomb on Nagasaki? People here were nothing but guinea pigs. At the time, I hated America for dropping the bomb. But that's not all. I also felt hatred toward the Japanese government for starting the war.
Here we are, all these survivors. And he also said the point about how after the bomb he hated the Japanese militarists also. So he's a man who keeps a clear line of distinction between good and bad. He has a sense of it.
Can everybody move quickly? Yeah. Look at all the monuments.
Peter Kuznick conducts a peace study tour in Japan every August for U.S. and Japanese university students. He's been organizing the event for the past 18 years.
One of the things I recommend is the night of August 5th. From the Chinese perspective, World War II was about Japanese invasion, Japanese atrocities, and then you say the war ended with the atomic bomb. So we're going to see very conflicting narratives here about the war. And then within each country, we're going to see contradictory narratives also.
All of the students read a certain book.
Interpretation of these events from the standpoint of all of humanity.
It was written by the American journalist John Hersey and is titled Hiroshima. Hersey visited the city the year after the bombing and gathered victims' stories. Hiroshima was published at the end of 1946. American readers were horrified by the brutal conditions created by the blast, symbolized by the mushroom cloud. On this day, the group is following Hersey's footsteps in Hiroshima.
Much bigger than that.
Their guide is Koko Kondo.
Bigger area.
Hersey interviewed her father, the Reverend Kiyoshi Tanimoto, a survivor of the bombing.
So Hersey's book mentioned about many people or escaped to come to this spot. So of course, my father came here and helped the survivors. And I think you read it in some part, there were so many people who asked for water, as you read. But so he was able to find a little cup and gave each person the water.
Hersey's graphic depiction of the bomb's devastation helped ignite an anti-nuclear arms movement in the United States.
But in here, there were so many, bodies laid down. And according to my father, that every one of them looks the same faces, all tomorrow. It was kind of difficult to identify each one of them. Just so swallowed. And only they can tell, the family could tell, is a voice. If somebody said, "Mother, I'm here," then somebody, the family, could find their own daughter because of the voice. So the faces, everybody, same face.
At the time, the U.S. government made a case for the bombs, saying they saved many American soldiers' lives. The movement against nuclear weapons gradually lost steam.
A book, it's like any other book. It's how it works in your head, which is different than in reality. And so the part, to me, looks different than I imagined it, and this is much more real.
The war would have ended either way, with the Soviets having, with Russia having entered from the west side, and that America was aware of that, and that the drop was more a show of power rather than to end the war. So that is that's new for me to understand, and I'm sure for most Americans.
On August 6th, Hiroshima marked the anniversary of the bombing. People floated lanterns for the victims on a river near the blast's epicenter. Stone inscribed one lantern with these words: "Memory is the slender thread of our civilization. Let us never forget Hiroshima."
Mr. Stone, what went through your mind as you visited Hiroshima and Nagasaki for the first time?
Well, we worked on this series for 5 years, so we already had formed the core conclusions about what the nuclear bombs, the atomic bombs did. But going to these places and putting flesh on the bone is very moving and chilling. You get the stories about what it was like to have flesh hanging off your bones, melting eye sockets, the amount of dead people, the smell. These people lived it. They saw an enormous amount of death, and they were stunned. They were confused. Many of the Japanese people we find were in the dark about what was going on. They thought that the Japanese were winning the war. They were told that. They didn't get enough food. There wasn't much here, and afterward, when they heard a lot of people, when they heard the emperor, that was the first time they ever heard his voice in Japan. You can imagine the lack of communication between government and people. Treated very badly, and as I said earlier, it took me many years to recognize the horror of what they had gone through. They could not get treatment. Many of them died of radiation sickness after the blast. The burns killed a certain percentage. I don't know what the percentage was, maybe up to 40–50% died from radiation poisoning afterward. And by the way, the effects are still possibly ongoing. People are not sure if the cancers that they have are the result of the radiation. The black rain, they called it, in Japan.
Mr. Stone, as we just saw, you wrote that memory is the slender thread of our civilization. I would like to ask about the thoughts behind those words. Could you tell us?
Because it is the basis of a history. Why do people write the histories? To remember what happened in their time. And without memory, we are beasts, we're animals. We have no consciousness of what we've learned in our lifetime, and it allows us to act without guilt. Memory keeps us together as a tribe. We have a collective, it's bad if we have a collective myth, like in the United States, that the atomic bomb was necessary. What we need is an accurate memory. And that, if we could deal with our guilt, the need not to drop the bomb, we dropped the bomb, if we could deal with that, my God, we'd be a much stronger nation. As a result, we're unhealthy, as is Japan in their telling of their story of the Japanese war in Asia.
We have photographs of the 2 atomic bombs. The one dubbed Little Boy is on the left. It used highly enriched uranium and was dropped on Hiroshima. To the right is Fat Man. This plutonium-fueled device was used on Nagasaki.
It sounds inhumane, but perhaps President Truman wanted to try out both bombs. Scientists were opposed to using atomic bombs, at least according to the documentary, and yet the US dropped different bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in a very short period of time. I wonder what the US experts say about that.
It was an experiment. I mean, there was no need to drop 1 bomb, but 2 bombs. We were experimenting to find out the truth of how effective the weapon could be against cities and destruction of cities. Because the Soviet Union was a factor. How could we stop the Soviet Union?
And it's a good thing that the United States did not also have a thorium bomb, or else a 3rd city would have been taken out.
That's true. If the Nazis had dropped the bomb, in Europe, and lost the war, they would have been in war crimes for the Nazis, for dropping the bomb. But we won the war, and there was never any contention of our usage of the war. The United States was a winner. So no one is going to drag us in the war crime dock.
John Hersey, you clearly communicated the reality of Hiroshima, don't you think?
It was published in the New Yorker magazine. It was widely read. Albert Einstein ordered thousands of copies, as did many other people. It was read night after night on national radio by people like Paul Robeson, great American actor and singer, an activist. And this shocked the American people. When the bomb was first dropped, 85% of the American public said they supported it. 23% of the American people said they wished Japan had not surrendered so quickly so the United States could have dropped more atomic bombs on them. There was tremendous hatred toward the Japanese after Pearl Harbor and the Bataan Death March and World War II. And what happened was, for a year, the Americans felt great about dropping the bomb. But then John Hersey's book came out, and it humanized the Japanese citizens for the first time, the citizens of Hiroshima. And many Americans were shocked by this portrait of Japanese suffering and what the atomic bomb does. And many people who had written before what a good thing it was said they felt terribly guilty now. So the Americans began to change and began to question that early. And since then, there's been a struggle for memory, which is what Oliver and I are engaged in. It's that fight for an uncorrupted understanding.
But in Japan, Hersey's book was not really played up at all. I think the censorship authorities, it was not commented on. It was released in Japan.
It's almost unknown now in Japan. It was voted, a panel of expert journalists at New York University voted it the most important work of journalism in the 20th century. So it's somewhat known in the United States, but in Japan, it's almost unknown.
After World War II, anything considered to be against the U.S. occupation of Japan was strictly censored. There was also the issue of protecting nuclear data. Preventing leaks was a matter of deep concern. So the term new-type bomb was used instead of atomic bomb for a long time to protect nuclear secrets and maintain social order during the occupation. The Japanese author Tamiki Hara is known for the novel Natsu no Hana, or Summer Flowers. The original title was Genshi Bakudan, or Atomic Bomb, but censors made him change it.
There were no public symposiums about the atomic bomb allowed really till 1952, because the United States didn't want this discussed, because we knew how much the Japanese people would be angry about this, and they would rise up against the U.S. occupation forces.
And the hibakusha told us repeatedly that there was no government attention to their condition until mid-1950s. It took 10 years or more for the Japanese government to even give them treatment. They organized themselves into a collective, the hibakusha, and they started to demand recognition, and they demanded medical treatment.
Because the Americans set up the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission in Hiroshima and Nagasaki after the war to study the victims. Not to treat them. They didn't get treatment, but they were turned into guinea pigs and studied. And when they died, their organs were shipped back to the United States so that we could study them more. Many of the hibakusha who were put through this humiliating, dehumanizing treatment were furious about it and still are.
Professor Kuznick, you've been taking young students to Hiroshima for 18 years now. What's your purpose in organizing these tours?
We want this generation to remember. The hibakusha, many of them are getting older, and they're dying off. They have a very powerful message that I want to bring to young Americans. They reacted to this. They could have reacted with hatred, with anger, with bitterness, with rage. That's not how they reacted. Their reaction was, I want to take this horrible experience, what happened to me, and turn it into something positive. And the hibakusha have led the fight for nuclear abolition ever since. I nominated them for the Nobel Peace Prize on several occasions because they deserve it for what they've done. So there's a spirit of Hiroshima and a spirit of Nagasaki which wants to educate the world in a positive way and get rid of these weapons. And I want my students to experience that.
If the United States has a hidden history, a history that the American people haven't discussed, maybe we Japanese haven't truly talked about World War II either.
We Japanese?
Yes, when people in our country talk about the war, we tend to focus on the sacrifices made by Japanese civilians. But people hardly talk about what happened in China or in the Philippines. So the U.S. and Japan may each have their own untold history. I think it's very important that Americans are finally getting the historic facts about the atomic bombings.
After the bombs were dropped, the world entered the Cold War and the nuclear arms race was on. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 came very close to triggering a nuclear war.
Oliver Stone believes that President Kennedy's actions during the Cuban Missile Crisis saved the world from a nuclear catastrophe.
Now, we owe a lot to Kennedy, and that was a great moment in time. Unfortunately, he would have won he was so popular that he would have won the election in 1964, and then he could have really done much more. He wanted to withdraw from Vietnam. He never went into Laos. He wanted to make a negotiation with Castro. He wanted to end the Cold War with Khrushchev. He negotiated. The greatest thing he said of his administration was the nuclear peace treaty that he made with Khrushchev in '63. He was very proud of that.
This is a great young American, and if he'd been elected in '64, there would have been 4 more years of Kennedy and 4 more years maybe of his brother Robert, and I don't think the powers that be in the United States could stand the idea of a peacemonger like Henry Wallace being in power, any more than the Russians could stand the idea of Gorbachev after a while giving up all their power. The people who are sometimes the most compassionate, like Martin Luther King, lose out to history. Sometimes they're crushed, but they live on in our memories because they actually achieved peace for people.
People who try to resolve problems through dialogue are either assassinated or ousted. Why is that?
Because it seems to be the truth of politics is that the hardliners tend, not always, the hardliners, Lyndon Johnson and Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon, the hardliners tend to win out. They talk the game of power, and people honestly can be scared. They put fear into the population. That gives them the votes. Nixon was superb at this. He raised fear, divided the country, polarized it, and won election twice. Although he expanded the war in Vietnam and he extended it, it didn't matter. But Lyndon Johnson, after Kennedy, changed all of Kennedy's policies, except for the civil rights policy. Johnson expanded the war in Vietnam, went back to the Cold War. The hardliners tend to make the noise. Ronald Reagan was very successful running down Jimmy Carter, saying, soft, he's weak. So and Obama at the beginning was very effective because we thought we had great hope, because after the George Bush administration, he was talking soft. But he has not been soft. He's been hard.
The administration of President George W. Bush deployed massive military power around the world. After that, Barack Obama came into office calling for change. But Stone says he hasn't succeeded in altering the course set by his predecessor.
You sound very critical of President Obama.
Well, why not? Why not? We present the facts. We present to you what he did. After two terms of Bush, we turned to Obama with great hope. Change is change to be believed in was the slogan of the campaign. Change to believe in. What happened? He gets elected. We believe in democracy. He's a lawyer. He's a constitutional scholar. He's going to respect civil rights. He's going to respect the law. And the first thing he does, he immunizes Bush and Cheney from any prosecution for their war crimes, which include torture, which include illegal eavesdropping. Bush never even bothered to get a legal justification for eavesdropping. He just went around it. So instead of prosecuting and explaining this, Obama did the opposite. He institutionalized these things as a Democratic president. That is even far more dangerous. We all hated Bush, many of us did. But with Obama, it's very hard to go against Obama because he was a liberal, so we thought, and he spoke with a soft voice. So he has done more damage to democracy, actually, although Bush is pretty bad. Obama has, by not changing back to the old ways, has now put us on this path. And on top of it, he's expanded the eavesdropping to be a global endeavor. The NSA is now capable of its technology of eavesdropping on everybody, every nation, and we know what's going on now. We've heard about it somewhat. It's even worse, I'm told. It's even worse. Obama reassures us. He says, don't worry, we're not listening to your personal conversations. No, but you're telling us we can, and maybe one day we will. Because maybe when Obama's gone from the presidency, what if we get another George Bush or Dick Cheney or Bush father or Ronald Reagan or Richard Nixon? We've had horrible leadership. This massive eavesdropping has not really revealed any plots. What reveals the plots is hardcore intelligence work, police work at ground level. They are doing this anyway. They know who the terrorists are. They can track them down. They don't have to bug everybody in the world to find a group of terrorists. They can do it without that. So it's overkill, as they say, completely exaggerated. And the American people, as always, get panicked, as Truman scared us after World War II, to say the Russians are here, the Russians are coming. This is the same story. The terrorists are here. The terrorists are everywhere.
They're in your soup. They're in your refrigerator. What we must protect you. Well, the truth is, we need protection from the U.S. government. The U.S. government is breaking the law against the people of the world.
But don't many Japanese still look at the U.S. as a role model for democracy?
I don't think it's all that simple. It's a rather complex issue. In Japan, people with political power basically see Obama as weak, ineffectual, and too liberal. They want him out of office. I bet business leaders feel the same way. Many Japanese continue to believe that Japan-U.S. relations are stronger when Republicans are in power in the U.S. and liberal Democrats are at the helm in Japan. But if you asked me, would John McCain or Mitt Romney have been better, I'd still say I'm glad it's Obama. I do think Obama is the better choice. At the same time, Mr. Stone says there are things even the Obama administration can't change. NSA officials didn't start their surveillance because Obama told them to. They've been doing it for a long time, and no one stopped them.
Oliver Stone drew on his own experiences to make movies about the Vietnam War. 2 won Academy Awards. His critical stance cuts deep into the dark side of politics and has won support worldwide. Let's continue our discussion with Oliver Stone. I've been wanting to ask you, Mr. Stone, how did you get started in film? Why did you want to become a director?
I didn't really have a relationship with anybody in the film business. After the Vietnam War, I was in New York. I was alienated, but I had always been interested in storytelling. I'd written a novel when I was 19. When I came back from the war, because I'd taken photographs over there, and because there was no ability to write on paper, the water was too wet. I used to take a lot of picture stills, and I loved the idea of combining the picture with the word. And that's what brought me to filmmaking, because that is the combination, picture and word. And I turned my writing, my storytelling ability to film, studied it at NYU Film School, and became a filmmaker gradually over time. I wrote many scripts. Many of them were rejected and not looked at or ignored. And eventually with Midnight Express in 7 years later, in 1978, I achieved success, and then after that, I learned as I went along. I mean, it's been an evolution. By the time I got to Salvador, I'd already been through a lot in my life with Vietnam, and politically, I became more involved, because as I said to you earlier, I was raised conservative, and it was the wars in Central America under Ronald Reagan that really made me wake up to the fact that we were going through Vietnam a second time.
Did you think you'd ever become so famous, with so much influence worldwide?
No. No, I mean, life is a process. That's the beauty of it. No, not even a thought. No, I'm sorry. I've evolved. You know, even the last 5 years with Peter here, doing this untold history of the United States, has deepened deeply my awareness of history and what the meaning of my birth, this atomic bomb, which is where I come into the story, what it means to all of us in the world. I feel like I'm a bit of a crusader, with a sense of I have a passion to tell the story of what went wrong with my country, the country I love, and I am a patriot. I served my country, and I would like America to be a better place. And it's failed miserably because of this love of money and love of militarization.
21 of Oliver Stone's movies have been released in Japan. If you were to pick one as your favorite, which would it be?
Of all the films I saw when I was young, certainly the most shocking was Platoon. War movies up to then always had a hero, but Platoon was different. It realistically depicted how people went through awful changes on the battlefield. I still remember the scene where a soldier is left behind by a departing helicopter. Soldiers from the same country are supposed to be united in war, fighting for the same cause. But we see their mutual hatred and betrayal. I do like Mr. Stone's other films, but Platoon is unforgettable.
How about you, Mr. Fujiwara?
Oh, you're asking the impossible. I'd say JFK is the most outstanding of them all. But the documentary South of the Border is also excellent. And Mr. Stone's latest film is a crime movie called Savages. He has experimented with all kinds of filmmaking. Mr. Stone has dealt with politics more than any director since Frank Capra. And compared with Capra, he portrays America's untold stories from a far more liberal or even radical viewpoint. Wall Street, for instance, turned the spotlight on the dark side of the U.S. economy during an economic bubble.
What do you think of what's being said about your work?
Who, me or him? Oh, me. No, listen, they're all, for me, they're all children, you know, they're all involved. I'm passionate about every one of them, so I remember my life by the years I made them film. If you ask me what happened in 1993, I know where I was from the film I did, which means to say that I've evolved. The stories, the theme that brings the movies together to some degree is most cases is the evolution of a person, a protagonist, who learns something about himself or society, and it changes him in the course of the movie.
Is W also your child? Did you write the lines in the script from imagination?
No, the W script was written with Stanley Weiser and me, and we took all the dialogue from Bush, was quite funny. Some of the stuff he says is so silly and stupid. We like that. It's kind of satiric. The movie is satiric. And we put it into his mouth, but we also had to imagine scenes behind closed doors, so there was an act of, it's called a historical drama. But we definitely based it on as much reality as we could get. The father plays a huge role here because the son is always trying to outdo the father. And that becomes the story of America, too, because Mr. Bush makes worse mistakes than his father. His father made a huge mistake going into Kuwait, as we describe in our series, but the son did even worse by going into Iraq and Afghanistan. Oh, my God, the sins of the father are visited on the son twofold.
About 30 members of our studio audience have seen the documentary. Does anyone have a question or comment for Mr. Stone or Mr. Kuznick? How about the gentleman over there?
Mr. Stone, I think your films reflect your sincere pursuit of the truth, and that appeals to our hearts. I've watched many of your movies and the documentary. What struck me the most was your denunciation of journalism. If all journalists gathered accurate information in the field every day, delivered it to the public, and accumulated the facts, then I don't think politicians would be able to distort the truth unbeknownst to us and plant myths in people's minds. Mr. Stone, what do you think of the current state of American journalism?
I look at it as dreadful. I think television controls most of the news medium, and unfortunately, the television news in our country is dismal. It's sixth grade level, very low level, simplistic, good guy, bad guy. Ed Snowden is an outlaw. He breaks the law. He's going to be hunted down. I mean, it's like a cowboy movie. And also, I think the liberal establishment in my country is a Cold War establishment. They want the Cold War. They see the United States as having to be the empire. It needs the muscle in order to enforce what they think is the legitimacy of the world order, the new world order. which is commerce, free trade, prosperity, but at the price of domination.
I understand you served in the Vietnam War, Mr. Stone, so I'd like to ask you about that. One could say that Japan suffered the atomic bombings and many civilian casualties because it attacked Pearl Harbor and wouldn't surrender despite repeated attacks. But what did the people of Vietnam do to the United States?
Yes, we showed in Platoon that there was an enormous amount of racism, as there was in Korea, as there was in the Japanese War, from the Americans towards the Vietnamese. We dehumanized them, as is often the case in war. And I made the point in Platoon that a certain part of us, a certain part of every platoon, I was in 3 combat platoons, a certain part of every platoon had a humanitarian side, and that was what saved us. I think that they were responsible. They did not take lives or abuse women and steal property and burn villages. Most of the Americans were split. There was another side of the American experience that was very dehumanized and hated the Vietnamese. So, as with every war, there was collateral damage, but of this kind, it was very ugly.
Vietnam, one of the things that disturbs us a lot is that the recent surveys show that 51% of Americans between the age of 18 and 29 say Vietnam was not a mistake, that Vietnam was right. 51%, we're shocked. People over 60, it's 70% who say it was wrong. But the younger generation is not learning the truth. And that's the danger of not learning history. If you don't learn history and you see these wars as justifiable, as good in many cases, then we're going to get involved in more wars. And one of the reasons we don't want to see the Japanese change Article 9 and get rid of the peace constitution, and we don't want to see the Japanese boys coming back in body bags. We don't want to see Japan as part of this. So the Japanese have got to learn the lessons of Japanese history and the lessons of American history, which is the goal of our Untold History Project.
I'm the child of a hibakusha from Hiroshima. I attended school through high school there and learned the importance of the anti-nuclear arms movement. I also attended church services given by the Reverend Tanimoto, the pastor we heard about in the video. Mr. Stone's documentary really took me aback. It makes me, I'm sure many people, want to learn more about our country's history. But I feel the Japanese government is trying to keep a lid on the truth by not encouraging people to study the true history of this country. What do you think?
In Nagasaki, I had the opportunity to visit the museum there. It's a private museum. It's the only museum, I'm told, in Japan that details the aggression of the Japanese armed forces in all of Asia against Vietnam, Philippines, Burma, Korea, China, Indonesia, and also against white Caucasian prisoners of war. It was an awful, awful museum. And it's very little. It's a small museum. They don't have much money. It's so sad to see this, but I think to my own country, we do not have a peace museum in America. We have no nuclear. What I saw in Nagasaki, the museum in Nagasaki, just showing the American kids what a bomb looks like, what a plutonium bomb looks like, to see the number of missiles on a map and where they are. It can only help our understanding, but there is no such thing. So, Kichi, you have things to say about this. It's awful. The Japanese don't even know that there was tremendous aggression coming out of Japan in the 1930s and 40s.
When people talk about war, the discussion usually revolves around the damage other countries have inflicted on them, and they're deeply angered that people abroad don't talk about their suffering. This happens everywhere, including Japan. Hiroshima sends a universal message to keep telling the world about the truth of the tragedy that occurred there. The other is a criticism of present-day international relations, which continue to rely on nuclear weapons to maintain order. This has a universal meaning as well, but in one respect, this message is limited to the sacrifices of the Japanese people. So the bigger our need to tell the world about our own story, the more we need to look at sacrifices made by people of other nationalities. As Mr. Stone said, Japan may have untold stories, as America does, that may also be true of many other societies. Russia may have untold stories from the Soviet era. Exploring these stories may help us consider war from a broader perspective.
Mr. Bishop, your thoughts?
I realize now that we must be willing to spend time and effort to learn how different people look at history and about the thinking behind their views. Otherwise, I really don't think we'll find what you could call a philosophy to guide us towards the future.
I'd like to ask for your final comments. Could we start with you, Mr. Kuznick?
Unless the Americans and the Japanese together face our own histories and face historical truth and rewrite our histories and understand and learn our history. For example, 35% of Americans don't know that the United States bombed Hiroshima. 35% of Japanese don't know that the United States bombed Hiroshima. The similarities, the parallels are stark, enormous, and the need to tell the truth about history is similar in both countries. So we want to work together to expose the truth.
A friend of mine saw the Untold History on television and told me that her 12-year-old ran into the room and was looking at pieces of chapter 1 and 2, or chapter 1, and said, "Mom, did we fight the Japanese in World War II?" I repeat what I said what I wrote at Hiroshima. A truthful memory is the slender thread of our civilization. Let's keep our memory true.
Oliver Stone's final destination in Japan was Okinawa. The southernmost prefecture hosts the largest U.S. military base in East Asia. The Marine Corps' Futenma Air Base is located in Ginowan City. It's surrounded by densely populated neighborhoods. The local government and residents have been demanding its relocation. Stone has deep doubts about the U.S. policy of stationing troops in Okinawa and other parts of the world.
68 years this base has been here, these bases in Okinawa. The U.S. is trapped in a mindset of war and Cold War and fighting communism.
Stone headed for Henoko in Nago City. The area is under consideration for the relocation of Futenma Air Base. He wanted to speak with residents there who oppose the relocation.
The old versus the young. The old versus the young.
Were you a soldier?
Yes. I'm a disabled veteran.
Yes, he's a veteran.
Can't walk. I was injured. I don't like war. I'm in pain every day. I can't turn over in bed. I don't want any more war.
I don't know.
I can see that Okinawa is a sacred island and it has a great meaning to many people here. We feel strongly that there are no more bases, no more military bases should exist from the U.S. point of view. There are too big, too many all over the world.